You're out here looking for a shop floor air compressor that won't quit on you the moment you need it most, something sturdy enough for daily use, simple enough to maintain, and worth the dollars you're putting down. I get it. The market is flooded with machines that brag about horsepower, gallons, or fancy tech, but at the end of the day you just want a tool that fills a tire, powers a nail gun, or runs a paint sprayer without a hiccup. That's why I spent a few evenings digging through spec sheets, digging into Quincy's reputation, and looking at a handful of real-world scenarios before hitting record. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. The Quincy QD54 is a 5-horsepower, 60-gallon vertical compressor that runs on a single 230-volt, single-phase line. It's a splash lubricated, reciprocating design, which means the moving parts are constantly bathed in oil to keep friction down and heat in check. For anyone who's ever had a compressor overheat during a long paint job or a tire inflation marathon, that's a practical detail you can feel in the day-to-day. First, let's talk about the kind of workshop where this unit shines. Imagine a small auto body shop that needs to run a paint sprayer for a few hours each day, a pneumatic wrench for brake work, and maybe a couple of tire inflators for customer service. The QD54's 60-gallon tank gives you a solid reserve of air, so you're not constantly listening to that rhythmic pump cycle while you're trying to focus on a paint job. In practice, you get roughly 1,012 minutes of continuous air at 90 psi before the motor kicks back in. That's enough to finish a typical panel coat or run a tire inflator through several cars without the tank emptying and the motor whining. Now, who should actually consider buying this? If you're a DIY homeowner who only inflates a few bike tires a month, you'll probably be better off with a 2-gallon portable unit. The QD54 is overkill in that scenario, both in price and in the space it occupies. But if you run a small contracting business, a woodworking shop that uses a pneumatic sander, or a fleet maintenance garage, the extra tank capacity and the 5 HP motor translate into less downtime. The fact that it's a vertical model also means it sits on a small footprint, which is helpful if you're squeezed between workbenches. On the flip side, there are a couple of practical trade-offs you need to keep in mind. First, the splash lubrication means you have to keep an eye on oil levels. It's not a set and forget unit, you'll need to check the oil dipstick every few weeks if you're running it daily. That's a small maintenance task, but it's easy to overlook if you're used to oil-free compressors. Second, the 230-volt requirement means you'll need a dedicated circuit, which can be a hurdle for a home garage that only has standard 120-volt outlets. Running a new line isn't a massive expense, but it does add a layer of planning before you can even plug the machine in. One of the things that impressed me while researching was how Quincy handles the pump's cooling. The splash lubricated design keeps the pistons and cylinders cooler than many oil-free models that rely purely on air cooling. In a real-world setting, that translates to a longer lifespan for the pump itself. If you've ever owned a cheap compressor that started sounding like a jet engine after a couple of months, you'll appreciate that quieter, more controlled operation. Let's walk through a typical day using the QD54 in a small auto repair shop. You start the morning by turning on the compressor, listening to the motor settle into a steady hum. Within a minute, the pressure gauge climbs to 90 psi and the tank is full. A technician rolls a tire inflator onto a lifted car. The inflator draws air directly from the tank, filling the tire in under a minute. Next, a body shop tech pulls the air hose over to a paint sprayer. Because the tank holds enough air for several minutes of continuous spray, the tech can finish a full door panel without the motor cycling on and off, which would otherwise cause a visible dip in spray quality. When the tank does start to deplete, the motor kicks back in, and the transition is so smooth you barely notice it. At the end of the day, the oil check is quick, just a dipstick, a wipe, and a top-off if needed. If you're the type who likes to keep your shop tidy, you'll also like the QD54's integrated pressure gauge and regulator. The gauge is mounted on the front panel, so you can see the exact pressure at a glance, and the regulator lets you dial down from the 90 psi tank pressure to whatever your tool needs, be it 30 psi for a nail gun or 90 psi for a sandblaster. That kind of on-the-fly adjustability saves you from juggling separate regulators for each tool. Now, a word about noise. Reciprocating compressors are never whisper quiet, and the QD54 is no exception. It sits in